Captain Sarah Martinez never imagined that a routine patrol mission would turn into a fight for survival. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the disputed border region as her convoy of 3 armored vehicles moved steadily through the narrow mountain pass. She sat in the lead vehicle, studying the digital map on her tablet while keeping one eye on the rugged landscape ahead. Sarah had been deployed to this remote outpost for 6 months, leading a team of military engineers tasked with establishing communication towers in strategic locations. At 28, she was one of the youngest captains in her unit, but her expertise in field communications and her ability to stay calm under pressure had earned her the respect of both superiors and subordinates. The convoy consisted of 12 soldiers, including Sarah's core team of 4 specialists. Sergeant Mike Thompson, her second in command, rode shotgun beside her, constantly scanning the horizon through his binoculars. Behind them, Corporal Lisa Chen operated the radio equipment, maintaining contact with their base camp 15 miles away. Private Rodriguez, their youngest member at 19, handled the technical equipment they would need to install the communication array. The mission seemed straightforward enough. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy activity in the area, and they had traveled this route twice before without incident. Their destination was a strategic hilltop approximately 8 miles from their current position, where they would spend 2 days installing a sophisticated communication tower that would extend their operational range significantly. As the convoy navigated a particularly narrow section of the pass, Sarah noticed something that made her uneasy. The usual sounds of the mountains, birds calling, wind whistling through rocks, the distant bleating of goats, had fallen silent. The only sounds were their engines and the crunch of tires on loose gravel. She had learned to trust her instincts during her previous deployments, and, right now, those instincts were screaming danger. Sarah reached for her radio. "Base Camp Alpha, this is Convoy Charlie. We're approximately 2 miles from the installation site. Everything appears normal, but requesting confirmation that the area remains clear." The response crackled through the static. "Convoy Charlie, Base Camp Alpha. Latest intelligence shows no enemy movement in your sector. Proceed as planned, but maintain standard security protocols." Despite the reassurance, Sarah's unease persisted. She turned to Sergeant Thompson. "Mike, I want you to contact the rear vehicle. Tell them to increase following distance and be ready for evasive maneuvers." Thompson nodded without question. He had worked with Sarah long enough to know that when she got that look in her eyes, it was wise to listen. He relayed the message to the trailing vehicles, and Sarah watched in her side mirror as the convoy spread out, creating more space between vehicles. They had traveled another half-mile when Sarah spotted movement on the ridgeline above them. It was just a flash of reflected light, possibly sunlight bouncing off metal or glass, but it was enough to confirm her fears. She grabbed the radio microphone. "All vehicles, this is Charlie 1. Possible enemy contact on the ridge. Prepare for immediate evasive action." Her words were barely out when the first rocket-propelled grenade struck the rocky face just ahead of their lead vehicle. The explosion sent chunks of stone flying in all directions, and Sarah felt the armored vehicle shudder as fragments bounced off its reinforced hull. "Contact! Contact!" Thompson shouted into his radio as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions along the ridge. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles echoed through the pass, and bullets sparked off the armored plating of their vehicles. Sarah's driver, Corporal Anderson, immediately began evasive maneuvers, but their options were limited in the narrow pass. To their left was a steep rocky wall, and to their right was a dangerous drop into a deep ravine. Their only choice was to push forward or retreat, and retreating would mean turning around in the kill zone, a potentially fatal maneuver. "Push through! Push through!" Sarah commanded. "Get us to that bend ahead where we'll have some cover." The second vehicle in their convoy, commanded by Lieutenant Parker, was taking heavy fire. Sarah could see sparks flying from its armor as enemy bullets found their mark. The third vehicle had stopped and was returning fire with its mounted machine gun, trying to suppress the enemy positions on the ridge. As they approached the bend in the pass, Sarah saw their salvation, a cluster of large boulders that would provide cover from the ridgeline. But, just as they were about to reach safety, a second RPG streaked down from the heights above. This one found its mark. The explosion lifted the rear of their vehicle and sent it sliding sideways toward the edge of the ravine. Sarah felt herself thrown against the door as the vehicle tilted at a dangerous angle. Through the thick bulletproof windows, she could see nothing but empty air and the rocky bottom of the ravine hundreds of feet below. "Everybody out," she yelled, even as she felt the vehicle beginning to slide. The weight of the armored hull was pulling them inexorably toward the edge. "Emergency evacuation. Now!" Sergeant Thompson was already moving, kicking open his door and rolling out onto the rocky ground. Corporal Chen followed immediately, clutching the portable radio unit that was their lifeline to base camp. Sarah turned to help Private Rodriguez, who seemed stunned by the explosion. "Rodriguez! Move," she shouted, grabbing the young soldier by his equipment vest and pushing him toward the door. He stumbled out just as the vehicle lurched another few inches toward the precipice. Sarah was the last one out, and, as her feet hit the ground, she felt the vehicle give way completely. The armored hull scraped against rock as it slid over the edge, crashing down the mountainside in a thunderous cascade of metal and stone. Any supplies or equipment they had left inside was gone forever. But there was no time to mourn their losses. Enemy fire was still pouring down from the ridge, and bullets were striking the rocks around them, sending up clouds of stone dust. Sarah looked around desperately for better cover and spotted a natural depression in the rocks about 30 yards away. "Thompson! Shun! Rodriguez! Follow me," she called, pointing toward the depression. "Stay low and move fast." They began bounding from rock to rock, using whatever cover they could find. Sarah could hear the other vehicles in their convoy returning fire, but she knew they couldn't stay in this position much longer. The enemy had the high ground and clear fields of fire. Their only chance was to find a way out of the kill zone. As they reached the rocky depression, Sarah quickly assessed their situation. They had their personal weapons and whatever ammunition they carried, plus the portable radio that Chen had managed to save. But they were cut off from the rest of their convoy and pinned down by an unknown number of enemy fighters. Chen was already working with the radio, trying to establish contact with Base Camp. "Base Camp Alpha, this is Convoy Charlie. We are under heavy attack in Grid Square 77. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation. We have casualties and are separated from the main convoy." The response was filled with static, but they could make out the essential information. "Convoy Charlie, Base Camp Alpha. We copy your situation. Air support is being scrambled, but weather conditions may delay arrival. Maintain your position and await instructions." Sarah peered over the rocks toward the ridgeline where muzzle flashes continued to sparkle in the morning sunlight. She estimated at least a dozen enemy fighters, possibly more. They were well positioned and had obviously planned this ambush carefully. The timing of the attack, just as the convoy was most vulnerable in the narrow pass, was too perfect to be coincidental. "Mike," she called to Thompson, who was scanning the area with his binoculars. "Can you see the other vehicles?" "The second vehicle is about 200 yards back, taking cover behind some rocks," he reported. "I can see movement, so there are survivors. The third vehicle is in the same area, but I can't tell their status from here." "What about escape routes?" Sarah asked, studying the terrain around them. Thompson pointed to a narrow trail that wound up the opposite side of the pass. "There's what looks like a goat trail over there, but we'd be completely exposed crossing the open ground to reach it." Sarah nodded grimly. They were trapped, and the enemy knew it. The smart thing would be to wait for air support, but she had learned that in combat, waiting wasn't always an option. Sometimes you had to create your own opportunities. She was about to discuss their options with her team when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Enemy voices, speaking in a language she didn't recognize, were getting closer. The fighters on the ridge weren't content to keep them pinned down, they were moving to surround them. "Chen, how's that radio contact?" she asked urgently. "Still trying to reach base camp, Captain. The mountains are interfering with our signal. Keep trying. Mike, Rodriguez, check your ammunition. We may have to move soon." As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, a new burst of automatic weapons fire erupted from their left flank. The enemy had indeed moved to surround them, and their rocky shelter was about to become a death trap. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, running through their options. None of them were good, but staying put meant certain capture or death. They would have to take their chances in the open, trying to reach either the goat trail Thompson had spotted or find some other way to escape the closing net. She opened her eyes and looked at each of her soldiers. Thompson, steady and reliable, ready to follow her wherever she led. Chen, young but professional, still working frantically with the radio. Rodriguez, the youngest of them all, trying to hide his fear but ready to do his duty. "Listen up," Sarah said quietly. "We're going to move in 30 seconds. Our objective is that trail on the far side. We'll move in pairs, Thompson and Rodriguez first, then Chen and I will follow." Questions? There were none. These were professional soldiers who understood that sometimes survival meant taking calculated risks. Sarah checked her watch and began counting down in her head. 20 seconds. 15 seconds. 10 seconds. "Move," she whispered sharply, and Thompson and Rodriguez sprinted from cover, bounding across the rocky ground toward the distant trail. Enemy fire immediately shifted to follow them, bullets striking the ground around their feet and whining off nearby rocks. Sarah watched them make it about halfway before she and Chen began their own sprint. The distance seemed enormous as they ran across open ground with bullets cracking through the air around them. Sarah felt a sharp pain in her left shoulder but kept running, knowing that stopping meant death. They had almost reached the safety of the rocks near the trail when the third RPG of the morning screamed down from the ridgeline. The explosion knocked Sarah unconscious, and, when she finally awakened, she found herself alone in enemy territory, injured and miles from any hope of rescue. The real test of her survival was just beginning. Sarah's world returned in fragments, the taste of blood in her mouth, the smell of cordite and dust, the distant sound of voices speaking in an unfamiliar language. Her left shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and, when she tried to move, sharp pain shot through her ribs. She kept her eyes closed and her breathing shallow, instinctively knowing that any sign of consciousness might mean immediate death. The explosion had thrown her behind a cluster of rocks about 20 feet from where she and Chen had been running. Through barely opened eyes, she could see Chen's motionless form sprawled in the open ground where the RPG had struck. There was no movement, no sign of life. The young corporal who had been so dedicated to maintaining radio contact was gone. Sarah forced herself to remain still as enemy fighters moved through the area, checking bodies and gathering equipment. She could hear their boots crunching on the rocky ground, coming closer to her position. Her heart hammered against her ribs as one of the fighters approached the rocks where she lay hidden. The man stopped just feet from where she lay concealed behind a boulder. Sarah could see his worn combat boots and the barrel of his assault rifle as he scanned the area. She held her breath, knowing that the slightest movement or sound would give her away. After what felt like an eternity, the fighter moved on, apparently satisfied that this area was clear of survivors. For the next hour, Sarah remained motionless as the enemy fighters systematically searched the ambush site. She listened as they spoke among themselves, trying to pick up any words she might recognize. The language sounded Middle Eastern, possibly Arabic or Farsi, but she couldn't be certain. What was clear from their tone was that they were pleased with the success of their ambush. Eventually, the voices faded as the enemy fighters moved away from the immediate area. Sarah waited another 30 minutes before finally daring to move. Her left shoulder screamed in protest as she slowly shifted position to assess her injuries. The pain was intense, but she could move her arm, which meant it probably wasn't broken. Her ribs ached, and she could feel dried blood on her face from cuts caused by flying rock fragments. Carefully, Sarah checked her equipment. Her sidearm was still in its holster, and she had 3 full magazines of ammunition. Her survival kit was intact, containing water purification tablets, a small medical kit, emergency rations for 2 days, and a compact emergency radio. Most importantly, she still had her GPS unit, though she would need to be extremely careful about when and where she used it, as enemy forces might be monitoring for electronic signals. Sarah's first priority was to get away from the ambush site. Enemy fighters might return, and there was always the possibility that local civilians who sympathized with the enemy might report her location. She needed to find a secure hiding place where she could treat her injuries and develop a plan for escape. Moving carefully from rock to rock, Sarah began working her way up the mountainside away from the pass. Every step was agony, and several times she had to stop and rest as dizziness threatened to overwhelm her. The head injury from the explosion was affecting her balance, and she knew she might have a concussion. After 2 hours of painful progress, Sarah found what she was looking for, a small cave hidden among a jumble of large boulders high on the mountainside. The entrance was barely visible unless you knew where to look, and the cave itself was deep enough to provide shelter while remaining hidden from aerial observation. Most importantly, it had 2 possible escape routes if she was discovered. Once inside the cave, Sarah finally allowed herself to collapse. The adrenaline that had kept her moving was wearing off, and the full extent of her injuries was becoming clear. In addition to her shoulder and ribs, she had numerous cuts and bruises, and her left ankle was swollen, though it still supported her weight. Using her small flashlight, she carefully examined each injury and began basic first aid. The shoulder wound was the most serious, a deep gash probably caused by metal fragments from the explosion. Sarah cleaned it as best she could with water from her canteen and applied antibiotic ointment from her medical kit. She then fashioned a crude bandage from her spare undershirt. The ribs were bruised but didn't seem broken, and the ankle was sprained but functional. As night fell, Sarah allowed herself to eat one of her emergency rations and drink sparingly from her canteen. She had to make her supplies last, as she had no idea how long she might be trapped in enemy territory. Her GPS unit showed that she was approximately 12 miles from the nearest friendly outpost, but traveling that distance while injured and avoiding enemy patrols would be extremely challenging. Sarah spent her first night in the cave planning her escape route. Using the GPS and her knowledge of the terrain, she identified several possible paths back to friendly lines. The most direct route would take her across open ground where she would be easily spotted. A longer route through the mountains would provide better concealment but would take several days and require crossing areas she wasn't familiar with. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance interrupted her planning. Sarah crawled to the cave entrance and peered out at the night sky. In the distance, she could see the searchlights of aircraft sweeping the valley below. Her heart leaped with hope. It had to be a rescue mission looking for survivors from the convoy. Sarah reached for her emergency radio, then hesitated. Using the radio would reveal her location to anyone monitoring radio frequencies, including enemy forces. But it might also be her only chance to make contact with the search and rescue team. After a moment of agonizing indecision, she decided to wait. The aircraft were too far away, and the risk of compromising her position was too great. Over the next 2 days, Sarah remained hidden in the cave during daylight hours and made careful progress toward friendly lines during the night. Her injuries slowed her considerably, and she was forced to take frequent rest stops. The sprained ankle was getting worse, and her shoulder wound showed signs of infection despite her efforts to keep it clean. On the second night, while moving through a narrow valley, Sarah encountered her first enemy patrol. She heard voices and saw flashlight beams moving through the darkness ahead of her. Quickly, she found concealment among a cluster of rocks and waited as 3 enemy fighters passed within 50 feet of her hiding place. They were clearly searching for something or someone, possibly her. The close encounter convinced Sarah that she needed to change her approach. The enemy was actively hunting for survivors from the convoy, and they knew the terrain better than she did. Trying to evade them while injured and traveling on foot during her current route would eventually lead to capture or death. Sarah made a difficult decision. Instead of continuing toward the nearest friendly outpost, she would head for a more distant location where the enemy wouldn't expect her to go. Her GPS showed an abandoned weather station about 15 miles to the north, in territory that was technically neutral but effectively controlled by friendly forces. It would be a longer and more dangerous journey, but it might give her a better chance of reaching safety. The third day brought new challenges. Sarah's water supply was running low, and she had consumed her last emergency ration the night before. Her infected shoulder was causing fever, and she was becoming increasingly weak. Worse yet, she had spotted enemy aircraft circling the area several times, suggesting that the search for survivors was intensifying. That afternoon, while resting in another concealed position, Sarah heard something that filled her with both hope and terror. In the distance, carried on the mountain wind, was the sound of a firefight. Automatic weapons fire echoed through the valleys, punctuated by the thump of grenade explosions. Someone was fighting the enemy forces in the area, but she had no way of knowing if they were friendly troops or rival enemy factions. Sarah decided to investigate, moving carefully toward the sound of the battle. As she got closer, she could distinguish between different types of weapons. The steady, disciplined fire pattern suggested professional military training, possibly friendly forces conducting a search and destroy mission in the area. When Sarah finally reached a vantage point where she could observe the fight, her heart sank. It was indeed a professional military unit, but she couldn't tell from her distance whether they were friendly or enemy forces. The uniforms and equipment weren't clear enough to identify, and she didn't dare move closer while the battle was ongoing. The firefight lasted about 20 minutes before the shooting stopped. Sarah watched as one group of fighters withdrew toward the north while the other remained in position, apparently conducting a sweep of the area. She was about to retreat when she noticed something that made her blood freeze. One of the fighters in the group that had remained behind was carrying what appeared to be equipment from her convoy. She could see the distinctive antenna array from their communications gear, and one man was wearing what looked like a piece of American military equipment on his vest. These were definitely enemy fighters, and they had captured supplies from the ambush. But, more importantly, their presence here meant that the enemy was expanding their search pattern. They were no longer just looking in the immediate area of the ambush site, they were conducting systematic sweeps of the entire region. Sarah's planned route to the weather station would take her directly through areas they were likely to search. As night fell on her third day in enemy territory, Sarah faced a grim reality. Her injuries were getting worse, her supplies were nearly exhausted, and the enemy was closing in. She had maybe one more night of traveling before her strength gave out completely. If she was going to reach safety, it would have to be soon. Sarah checked her GPS one more time and made her decision. Instead of heading for the weather station, she would attempt to reach a small village about 8 miles to the west. Intelligence reports had indicated that the village was neutral, with residents who were not openly hostile to either side. It was a huge risk, the villagers might turn her over to enemy forces, but she was running out of options. As she prepared to leave her hiding place for what might be her final push toward freedom, Sarah heard a sound that made her freeze in terror. Dogs barking in the distance, and getting closer. The enemy had brought in tracking dogs to hunt for survivors. Sarah realized that her careful movement over the past 3 days had left a trail that trained dogs could follow. All her efforts to avoid detection had been undermined by something she hadn't anticipated. She had maybe an hour before the dogs reached her current position, and, in her weakened condition, she couldn't outrun them. Looking around desperately for options, Sarah spotted a small stream running through the valley below her position. Water might disrupt the scent trail and give her a chance to escape. But reaching the stream would require climbing down a steep, rocky slope while injured and in darkness. One wrong step could mean a fatal fall. The sound of the dogs was getting closer, and Sarah could now hear human voices as well. The hunting party was moving systematically through the area, and they would find her hiding place within the hour. She had no choice but to take the risk. Sarah began her desperate climb down toward the stream, knowing that her survival now depended entirely on reaching the water before the enemy tracking team found her trail. Behind her, the barking of the dogs grew louder and more excited as they picked up her scent. Time was running out, and Sarah was about to discover whether 3 days of survival in enemy territory had been preparation for freedom or merely a postponement of capture. The rocky slope seemed endless as Sarah half climbed, half fell toward the stream below. Each movement sent sharp pain through her injured shoulder, and her sprained ankle threatened to give way with every step. Above her, the barking of the tracking dogs grew more urgent, and she could hear their handlers shouting instructions in the enemy language. Sarah's hands were scraped and bleeding by the time she reached the stream. Without hesitation, she plunged into the cold mountain water, gasping as it shocked her fevered system. The stream was shallow but fast-moving, with rocks that made footing treacherous. She began wading downstream, staying in the water to break her scent trail while fighting to maintain her balance on the slippery rocks. The dogs reached her previous position within minutes, their barking becoming frantic as they lost the scent trail at the water's edge. Sarah could hear the handlers cursing and giving orders, spreading out along both sides of the stream to try to pick up her trail again. She knew she had bought herself time, but not much. Trained tracking teams would eventually work out that she had used the water to mask her scent. Sarah forced herself to stay in the stream for over a mile, despite the cold that was sapping her remaining strength. Her emergency training had taught her that dogs needed at least a quarter-mile break in the scent trail before their effectiveness dropped significantly. When she finally climbed out of the water on the far side, her whole body was shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. Finding shelter among some large rocks near the stream bank, Sarah tried to warm herself while listening for sounds of pursuit. The dog barking had faded into the distance, suggesting that her desperate gamble had worked. The tracking team was now searching the wrong area, giving her a temporary reprieve. But Sarah's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The infected shoulder wound was causing dangerous fever, and 3 days without adequate food or rest had pushed her body to its limits. Her vision was becoming blurry, and waves of dizziness made it difficult to stand. She knew that even if she evaded capture, she might not survive much longer without medical attention. As dawn broke on her 4th day behind enemy lines, Sarah made a desperate decision. She would activate her emergency beacon and hope that friendly forces could reach her before the enemy triangulated the signal. It was an enormous risk. The beacon would reveal her exact location to anyone with the right equipment, but she was too weak to continue on her own. Sarah found a position on high ground with a clear view of the sky and activated the small emergency transmitter in her survival kit. The device would broadcast a coded distress signal that could be picked up by friendly aircraft or ground stations. Once activated, it would continue transmitting for 48 hours or until the battery died. With the beacon active, Sarah settled in to wait. She found a well-concealed position among the rocks where she could observe the surrounding area while remaining hidden. Her pistol was ready, with 1 magazine loaded and 2 spares within easy reach. If enemy forces found her before friendly troops did, she was determined to make her last stand count. The hours passed slowly. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as her fever worsened, jerking awake each time she heard a sound that might indicate approaching danger. Several times, she saw enemy aircraft in the distance, but none came close enough to suggest they had detected her beacon signal. Late in the afternoon, Sarah heard something that made her heart race, the distinctive sound of American military helicopters in the distance. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades was unmistakable, different from the enemy aircraft she had observed over the past few days. But the sound seemed to be moving away from her position rather than toward it. Fighting off a wave of despair, Sarah realized that the rescue helicopters might not have the right frequency to detect her emergency beacon. Different military units used different communication systems, and there was always the possibility of equipment incompatibility. Her beacon might be broadcasting into empty air while Salvation flew past just miles away. As darkness fell, Sarah's situation became critical. Her fever was so high that she was becoming delirious, and she had consumed the last of her water hours earlier. The emergency beacon continued its steady transmission, but, after more than 8 hours, there had been no response from friendly forces. That night, Sarah experienced vivid hallucinations brought on by fever and dehydration. She imagined conversations with her fallen team members, saw enemy soldiers who weren't there, and repeatedly reached for her radio to call for help before remembering that it had been destroyed in the ambush. Her grip on reality was slipping, and she began to accept that she would die alone in these mountains. Dawn of the 5th day brought a moment of clarity as her fever temporarily broke. Sarah forced herself to drink from a small puddle of rainwater she found among the rocks, knowing that it might be contaminated but having no choice. She checked her beacon to ensure it was still functioning and tried to estimate how much battery life remained. It was during this brief period of lucidity that Sarah heard the sound that would save her life, the crack of a small tree branch somewhere below her position. It was a subtle sound that could have been caused by an animal, but something about it seemed wrong. Wild animals in this area had learned to be silent to avoid predators, and domestic animals would make more noise moving through the undergrowth. Sarah carefully positioned herself to observe the area where the sound had originated. For several minutes, she saw nothing. Then, a slight movement caught her eye, the hint of camouflaged clothing moving between the rocks about 200 yards away. Someone was approaching her position, moving with the careful discipline of a trained soldier. Sarah's hand moved to her pistol as she tried to determine whether the approaching figure was friend or enemy. The movement pattern seemed professional, with proper use of cover and concealment, but that didn't necessarily mean they were friendly forces. Enemy special operations troops were also well trained in tactical movement. As the figure moved closer, Sarah could make out more details. The camouflage pattern was unfamiliar, but the equipment visible on the soldier's gear appeared to be American or NATO standard. Most tellingly, the individual was moving in a pattern consistent with a deliberate search rather than a patrol or hunting mission. Sarah made a critical decision. When the approaching soldier reached a position about 50 yards from her hiding place, she would attempt to make contact. If they were friendly forces responding to her beacon, this might be her salvation. If they were enemy troops, she was probably going to die anyway, but at least she could take some of them with her. The soldier continued his careful approach, now clearly visible as a man carrying an assault rifle and wearing what appeared to be a communications headset. Sarah could see that he was scanning the area methodically, as if looking for something specific. When he reached the 50-yard mark, Sarah took a deep breath and made her choice. "American soldier," she called out, her voice hoarse from dehydration. "Captain Martinez, U.S. Army." The effect was immediate. The soldier dropped to one knee and brought his rifle to bear on her general position, but he didn't fire. Instead, she heard him speaking rapidly into his headset in English. "Command, this is Recon 2. I have contact with the missing American officer. Requesting immediate backup and medical support." Relief flooded through Sarah as she heard the familiar accent of an American soldier. She called out again, providing her unit designation and mission details to confirm her identity. The soldier, who identified himself as Staff Sergeant Williams from a Special Operations Reconnaissance Team, approached cautiously while his teammates moved to secure the area. Sarah learned that her emergency beacon had indeed been detected, but it had taken nearly 24 hours for military intelligence to determine that it was a legitimate distress signal rather than an enemy trap. A joint task force had been assembled to investigate, consisting of special operations troops and helicopter support units. The rescue team had been searching the area for 8 hours before Sarah's beacon signal led them to her approximate location. Staff Sergeant Williams had been tasked with conducting the final search on foot while his teammates provided overwatch from concealed positions around the area. Within 30 minutes of first contact, Sarah was surrounded by a full rescue team. A medic immediately began treating her injuries while the team leader coordinated with helicopter support for medical evacuation. Sarah's infected shoulder wound required immediate attention, and her dehydration was severe enough to be life-threatening. The helicopter extraction was complicated by enemy activity in the area. Intelligence reports indicated that hostile forces were aware of the rescue operation and were moving to intercept. The rescue team had to establish a defensive perimeter around the landing zone while the medical team prepared Sarah for transport. As they waited for the evacuation helicopter, Sarah provided the rescue team with intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities that she had observed during her 5 days behind enemy lines. Her information about the tracking dogs and the enemy's search patterns would be valuable for future operations in the area. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors was accompanied by distant gunfire as enemy forces made contact with the outer security perimeter. The rescue team's supporting elements were engaged in a running firefight with hostile troops who were attempting to prevent the evacuation. Staff Sergeant Williams and his team worked quickly to get Sarah to the landing zone as the medical helicopter touched down under fire. Bullets struck the ground around them as they ran for the aircraft, but the helicopter's door gunners provided covering fire that kept the enemy at a distance. Sarah was loaded into the helicopter just as enemy mortar rounds began falling in the area. The aircraft lifted off immediately, climbing rapidly to escape the range of enemy small arms fire. Through the helicopter's window, Sarah could see muzzle flashes dotting the mountainside below as the firefight continued. During the flight to the medical facility, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as the medical team worked to stabilize her condition. The infection in her shoulder wound was severe, and she had lost dangerous amounts of fluid during her ordeal. But she was alive, and she was going home. Later, after surgery to repair her shoulder and several days of treatment for the infection, Sarah would learn the full extent of the rescue operation. The Joint Task Force had included over 60 personnel from multiple units, supported by attack helicopters and close air support aircraft. The firefight during her extraction had lasted for 3 hours, with several enemy fighters killed and others captured. Most importantly, Sarah learned that her survival and the intelligence she provided had helped military planners understand enemy capabilities and tactics in the region. The information about the tracking dogs led to changes in survival training for soldiers operating in similar environments. Sarah's ordeal behind enemy lines had lasted 5 days, during which she had traveled over 15 miles while severely injured and constantly hunted by enemy forces. Her survival had depended on her training, her determination, and, ultimately, on the dedication of the soldiers who refused to leave her behind. The experience would stay with Sarah for the rest of her military career, reminding her that survival often comes down to small decisions made under extreme pressure. Her decision to trust her instincts during the convoy mission, her choice to use the stream to break the scent trail, and her final decision to risk everything on the emergency beacon had all contributed to her survival. 3 months later, after recovering from her injuries, Sarah returned to duty with a new appreciation for the value of teamwork and the importance of never giving up hope. The soldiers who had risked their lives to rescue her had proven that the military's promise to leave no one behind was more than just words. It was a sacred commitment that could mean the difference between life and death in the world's most dangerous places.